So I have had the, I guess the advantage of growing up in a digital age. I was born in 1979. My first computer was a ZX Spectrum, and from that day onwards, I was kind of really addicted to technology and eventually the internet. And I was a very early adopter of the internet. I started using CompuServe back in probably about 95, 96. I was on kind of those old-style message boards and then joined the online forum culture and saw the rise of social media. And as part of that, actually became what I am today, where I'm standing in front of you talking about my experiences. And I've had a lot of experiences with people who have a wide variety of opinions that aren't always fact-based, it's fair to say. I've worked on topics that have included chemical weapon use in Syria, the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines MH17, the Flat Earth movement, and a whole range of different topics that have people who have really, really strong beliefs that don't seem to align with the realities that are based on evidence that I work on. And they take exception to my work and the work of Bellingcat because of that. And I was always trying to figure out why that was, because it seemed to make sense that based off the evidence that I was able to find through open source investigation that these facts must be true, but there were plenty of people who disagreed with that and also believed that I was working for the CIA or that Bellingcat was secretly funded by all kinds of different groups and stuff like that. So I watched a film a few years ago called Behind the Curve, which is about the Flat Earth movement, and that actually made me realize that what's actually happening here isn't distinct, separate things. It's actually the same system. So I've been working on developing a framework that kind of tries to explain this. And this framework is not about saying this is something that applies perfectly to every single situation. It's more just a way for us to think about this. But first, I think it's important to think about what this information environment exists in. It's not something that's separate from democracy. It's part of democracy. So let's start by just I've rather arrogantly gone through several hundred years of thinking about democracy and reduced it down to 3 words. So if you'll indulge me, I'll take you through what those words are. And these are, in my mind, when we think about the ideals of what democracy are, what we are trying to achieve. So the first is the idea of verification. That's not just fact-checking. It's the idea that we create processes, through the scientific methods, through political processes of trying to find what the truth is. Now, the truth is obviously a word that you hear a lot, and there's debate about it, but in this ideal world, we create systems that we move towards the idea of a shared understanding of what reality is. And that comes in many different forms. It can come through journalism, it can come through academic work. We then have deliberation, where we discuss those ideas in different forums, that it's inclusive, that we bring people together, that we're talking about ideas in a way that's inclusive, that is not about excluding people from those conversations. Again, this is an ideal, and obviously not every democracy has ever reached those ideals. And then there's the accountability. And that's not just about saying that people have to be found guilty of things. It's that when we have these deliberations, we have these discussions that based off this information we've tried to verify, we can make decisions on those, and that there are processes for that to happen. And when they fail, we have a response to that as well. So these are this is really just a way to kind of frame what I'm going to talk about next, which is disordered discourse. This builds on a lot of the work that many of you have worked on in the past. I'd like to specifically say Claire Wardle's work on information disorder was very influential in this. But I want to take this beyond just the idea of information and discourse itself, how we create an understanding as communities about the world around us. And I want to start with the work of Walter Lippmann. In 1922, he published the book Public Opinion, which was his attempt as a journalist to look at how public opinion is formed, especially in the wake of World War I. This is something that I find really useful to understand the 20th century way of approaching the media and information. One thing he talks about in this book is the idea that the real environment that we exist in, the information environment, is too big and too complex and fleeting for people to really understand it. So what happens instead if we have reality mediated through lenses, and that's really elite media control. So there is a world, and we have it see it through the lens of the media, the radio, television, cinema in his era. And that creates a shared understanding of the discourse in which we understand the world. The problem is that's imperfect, because it's who decides what we're seeing is not the group, it's the people who control the media. And it creates a version of the world that's simplified, it's not always accurate, but it's one that we can have debates around, that we can have discussions around. And that's not to say we agree on everything, but we kind of have at least one version of reality that, the grass is green and the sky is blue. The problem happens in 2007 when this thing turns up and basically ruins everything. So the launch of the iPhone in 2007, I think, is actually a really crucial moment in society, as strange as that might sound. And that's because it allows social media apps to flourish. So this is an animation that shows the growth of social media platforms from 2007 onwards. So this includes Facebook, which at that time has 26 million users. Keep in mind, Blue Sky, which I'm sure lots of you have joined recently, has about 35 million users at the moment. So that is quite a small amount. But the iPhone's launched, and we see a sudden rise in the amount of people using these platforms. And just look at the growth of Facebook. Within 5 years, Facebook grows to having over 1 billion users. And this is in part because we are connected using these devices that are in our pockets all the time, that there are apps that can be developed on these devices using the software that allows all kinds of social media companies to flourish. We have a huge growth in social media, and what I think this has led to is, rather than being this kind of shared information environment, is it splinters. And we end up as, I don't need to explain the idea of bubbles to you, but we end up all separated into little groups who have their own realities. And this is, I think, incredibly dangerous for democracy. So I want to take you through the idea of what disordered discourse is. So this is really a way to understand what's going on with this post-2007 situation. So I break this disordered discourse down into 4 parts. The first is the elements of disordered discourse. These are the kind of actual pieces, the type of information that makes it up. Then there are the drivers of disordered discourse. These are the incentives, the reasons that we share those elements. And then we have the agents, and these are the actual individuals and groups and communities who spread this information, and then the discourse that's created from that. So I'll take you through those one by one. First, the elements of disordered discourse. This is very much based, again, on Claire Wardle's work on information disorder, where we have the definitions of misinformation, which is false or misleading information spread without the intent to deceive. Disinformation, where it is created with the intent to deceive. And then malinformation, which is true information, but it's twisted in a way to cause harm. Now, these separation, I think, is really, really important, and I think as a kind of the counter-disinformation community, it hasn't always been great at making a distinction between the 3 of these. The public discourse has also done a really bad job of making a distinction between these 3. So often when people are talking about disinformation, they might actually be talking about misinformation, so the people who've spread misinformation suddenly feel that they're being attacked because they just really believe this stuff. They aren't intentionally trying to deceive people. So I think those separations is really important. We then have these drivers. So I find it really frustrating that often when we talk about disinformation in the public, it's so focused on individual drivers. It's like, oh, Russia's making us believe something, or this politician's lying. It's actually really what I would say is a group of different types of drivers, and I've attempted to categorize them. So we have these structural and technological drivers. So this is stuff like the way the algorithm works, that people now have online platforms that reward monetization for engagement, that traditional gatekeepers, the newspapers have, for example, have really failed to adapt to these new technological changes, and that the information ecosystem itself is fragmenting. We then have psychological and social drivers. So we have biases and motivated reasoning, we have identity and community reinforcement, doctrine enforcement and purity testing, just look over at America at the moment and see that in action, and crisis catalyst and fear-based thinking. And then we have the political and economic drivers. So there's the weaponization by state and political actors, and stuff like astroturfing, covert influence campaigns, the failure of policy and the law, and polarization and media fragmentation. The thing is, these aren't always the same in every single situation. Depending on the individual, the group, they can change depending on the circumstances. So we always need to consider what these drivers are. And I think it's important to understand this because when we're thinking about interventions, if we're always doing kind of top-down interventions, we aren't always addressing these drivers. We need to think about how do we look at each of these drivers and address those, rather than saying, oh, well, let's point the finger at Russia again. So I want to give you an example of this in practice. So some of you might know the channel Hoof on YouTube. Does anyone know that channel? Or is it just me being weird? Okay, one other weirdo in the audience. That's great. So this is a guy who goes around Scotland cleaning the hoofs of cows. And it's slightly gross, but it's kind of entertaining to watch. I'm really into it. I don't know why. Something must be wrong with me. But as I was clicking through these videos, I started noticing I was getting recommendations for other channels. And some of them were like, there's a guy called Nate the Hoof Guy, who's an American who does the same kind of thing. But then I came across this channel, Cleaning Hoof Action. I've blurred out the hoofs because they're really gross. They're covered with maggots, they've got nails in them. And there was another one called John Hoof Care with the really AI-generated imagery. You can see here there's nails that are just jammed into these hoofs. It looks horrible. And there's another one. This is actually a weather channel in Vietnam, but for some reason they've got hoof cleaning videos on them. One thing you may have noticed is P. Diddy in one of the preview images. And this is a clue to what's happening here. These are fake hooves videos. None of them are real cow hooves attached to an actual cow. What they've been doing, they've seen the success of the Hoof GP, and they're trying to capture the algorithmic recommendations so they can get the monetization from producing the content. So when I'm talking about these drivers, it's not always political. Sometimes it can be making cash. And if you go back, you can see earlier videos in those channels are things to do with construction, for example. They also do things like cleaning sidewalks, which was something that was quite popular on social media in the US. So what they're trying to do is make fake versions of real content so they can just get the money from it. Now, a lot of these videos have now been banned because they were reported for animal cruelty. And now when these new channels that are emerging that are again doing these fake hooves videos explicitly say, these are not real cow hoofs, we've got them from a butcher's, this is just for educational purposes, but it's still to capture that algorithm. So this doesn't create disordered discourse. No one's going around saying, hey, everyone, let's talk about these hoofs videos that we're seeing. But it does give you an idea at that kind of driver level how this can operate. But what's really important is the agents. So this is the kind of third layer. And I've broken this down into 4 categories. One are official state, political, and government actors. So this is the really obvious stuff. These are the politicians who are lying to us, that kind of thing. Then there's the proxies of those. So those can be covert, such as the Internet Research Agency, or overt, like the Russia Today, Press TV. It can include captured media, people who are journalists who have a very strong political bias and can't move beyond that. Then you have self-interested actors. So these are really people outside of that. You could say that the fake hooves people are the self-interested actors in this system. These are people who just have their own agendas. It could be just getting engagement so people click on their stuff and that they get more followers. It could be they're trying to make money out of it. They might be trying to convince you to buy this cryptocurrency so they can sell their cryptocurrency when it suddenly goes up. But central to all of this are the true believers. And these are the people who really believe this stuff. These are the people who, after the kind of public discourse has moved on, will still discuss this stuff, debate it, and will make it their entire personality. I think, though, often when we think about these true believers in the past, even if we haven't really defined them this way, we think of them as being influenced by these outside actors. They're poor victims of disinformation coming from these different groups. But really what we're seeing is a system that's constantly engaging with all these different groups and communities in many cases, and we need to see it in this context. So one example I can give you is news influencers. These are, really social media-enabled individuals who've, built a following because they talk about the news. They don't really kind of do investigation. They just have an audience and they know how to appeal to their biases. And a great example of that is a guy called Jackson Hinkle. Are any of you familiar with Jackson Hinkle? Yeah, a few of you, unfortunately. I personally think he's not a great person, but in terms of categorization, I do not believe he's a true believer. Now, maybe he wants to send me an email and say, no, you're wrong, I really believe all this stuff, but he started off as a teenager in college being focused on the environmental movement, then he became a Bernie Sanders supporter, and now he calls himself MAGA communist. And he was banned from a lot of social media platforms, including Twitter. When he was banned, he had 500,000 followers. Elon Musk restored him, and through the conflict in Gaza, he gained 2 million followers sharing information, often which was completely false, including AI-generated images and videos from places like Syria that were misattributed. Now, he was invited to Donbass back in 2024 in the summer, and he got to meet lots of people who are fighting, as he say, for the liberation of Donbass in 2014 onwards. You don't just turn up at the Donbass and start filming. It seems pretty clear that he was invited to do that. And that became even more clear when he published this video a couple of weeks later, where he was invited to the United Nations to talk about Ukrainian terrorism. And this is the video he published. Just note as well the way he talks about the media, because this is a theme that turns up time and time again.
We're here at the United Nations about to give a brief presentation, do some Q&A with the mainstream media about a recent trip to the Donbass. My first time here. It's going to be pretty cool, so be sure to tune in. I'm going to be sharing all the links and everything, but I'm sure the mainstream media is not going to like what we have to say.
So he was invited by the Russian delegation to speak at the United Nations at a press conference, effectively, which means that they get a nice UN logo behind their speakers. And this is what he said at the press conference, which you can see is pretty sparsely attended.
I want to share my experiences from my recent trip to the newly liberated territories of the Russian Federation in the Donbass. My journey took me to Mariupol, Tokmak, Berdyansk, Melitopol, and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant over my 7-day trip, providing me with firsthand insights that starkly contradicts the lies and the narratives that have been propagated by the mainstream media and the Western political elite here.
So again, the idea that the mainstream institutions are lying to you. So this footage is then inevitably shown on Russia Today. Just also listen to how they frame the people who are participating in this and how the Chirons describe them.
As Western powers ship seemingly countless billions of weapons to Kyiv, its media has failed to fairly cover the Ukrainian conflict, including the dangers brought on by America's involvement. Now, that's according to a group of legal and political experts who addressed the UN after a trip to observe the conflict zone.
Most shockingly was my visit to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Several points of critical infrastructure at the plant have recently been compromised by Ukrainian drone attacks and shelling.
So they were described as political and legal experts. This is a guy off Twitter who just got popular by posting a lot. So this is an example of this model in action. So we have the official state actor, in this case Russia, going to the self-interested actor, Jackson Hinkle, sending him off to the Donbass so he can make some posts. Then they invite him back to the UN and say, hey, do you want to talk to the UN, which is really just a press conference. Notice in Russia Today's coverage, they say he went to speak to the UN, not at a sparsely attended press conference that no one was really interested in. And then we have Russia Today as the proxy actor amplifying that. And all three of those are trying to influence true believers. Jackson Hinkle wants a bigger audience so he can get more monetization. You obviously have agendas behind the Russian state as well. But this is just one example of this in action. And this isn't the first time this has happened either. I've seen, for example, people like Eva Bartlett, who was very responsible for a lot of anti-white helmet sentiment, being hosted at the United Nations in exactly the same way, and then promoted on Russia Today in exactly the same way. When Russia was heading the UN Security Council, they had all kinds of bloggers and online news influencers come up and talk about how chemical attacks weren't real, how Ukraine was evil, and then that footage was used on Russia Today and state media to say, hey, look, we've got these people supporting our agenda. So This is just an example of how we can actually use this on a kind of more focused level, this framework, to examine these situations. Then we have the stages of how disordered discourse really develops. So we've had the agents who are spreading misinformation, disinformation, malinformation. We have drivers behind them doing it. It could be because they want money. It could be want the political influence. But communities form around this. So what we have are people who start questioning. They ask questions. They say, are COVID vaccines safe? What's happening in Ukraine? Now, not everyone's going to ask a question and become a conspiracy theorist. This is not what I'm saying. But it's the start of a journey for some people. They start engaging with information. And that's when these drivers start kind of really coming into play. The kind of information they engage with will often be information that's algorithmically recommended to them. It's information that reinforces their own biases that they listen to versus the stuff that they disagree with. And they get drawn more and more into this. And those drivers, depending on how strong they are and what they are, will draw them towards certain types of communities. And a group identity starts forming. We are the people who believe this. We are not the people who believe this. It's really important that they start understanding that there's this group of them. And the internet is brilliant at bringing people together who have the same opinions. And over time, those opinions become institutionalized within the group. That, in fact, you have gatekeepers within those groups who decide, I'm the kind of loudest voice in the group, and this person is kind of disagreeing with the group, therefore those are the ones who must be attacked. You have people who are, the most followed within the community, so are kind of defining what this community thinks and feels. And we can see this over a whole range of different topics. I'm sure all of you within your own work are probably thinking of some examples yourself. Eventually, that leads to a situation where anyone outside of the group is the enemy. I've experienced this personally on Syria, on MH17, on chemical weapons, that I am the most awful person in the world because of the work that I do, according to certain groups on the internet. And these are groups that have kind of been captured by this institutionalized way of thinking around the topic that they're interested in. And then that creates discourse absolutism. You cannot disagree within the group with anything the group believes, because then you're externalized from the group and then you're attacked. That all information that you receive on any topic is actually then seen through the lens of the group as well. And that becomes the lens through which they see the world. It was very interesting for me looking at the community that emerged around Syrian chemical weapon denial dealing with the COVID pandemic. Because they started seeing that COVID pandemic through the lens of those previous biases, that distrust in the government, the media. And they kind of started crossing over with the alternative health movement as well. So you start seeing these groups crossing over with each other, kind of the Venn diagram of these groups being drawn together as one big circle eventually. And a good example of how this operates is a survey someone did of QAnon followers. They asked, how did you become a QAnon follower? Why do you believe in QAnon? And they told lots of stories to them, and he realized there was a pattern of behavior behind this every single time. It always began with a distrust of the establishment. But it wasn't always about this left or right kind of thing consistently. Sometimes there could be people who are kind of more on the kind of old school kind of hippies. It could be people who are angry about Obama or the Clintons. They believed in a new world order. All these different ideas, but there was always a sense of distrust in the establishment. And that was then codified by a huge crisis. Something happens in their life that might be a personal crisis, it might be a political crisis, social. It could be a guy whose wife has left him and taking the kids, who's now a men's rights activist, kind of all these different things. But that leads to them going online and doing their own research. But because of those drivers, they are lead to places that are reinforcing those biases that they already have. So in the case of QAnon, it's a whole range of different things. It's the Loose Change documentary on 9/11. It's the Q Proofs analysis of Q's posts, it's YouTube channels. There's a really interesting podcast documentary called Rabbit Hole by the New York Times that follows one individual's YouTube channel history as he was radicalized through the early 2010s onwards. And I would really recommend listening to that, because that gives you a really good sense of how someone can be drawn into it. The person who's the topic of the podcast eventually turned away from that, and he's interviewed as part of the podcast, but it makes a fascinating insight into how people are drawn into these communities. And these are just some of the examples of the anecdotes that he was provided with. There was many of them. So there's one here, like 9/11 was the seed. The Israeli art project in the Twin Towers clinched it for me. Down the rabbit hole they went. The Kenyan being elected and the world apology tour. So you have all those drivers that are, all those elements that are there, pulling them into these conspiracy theories. And then you end up like with people like this storming the Capitol and getting away with it. So another way to look at this is when you ask a question on the internet, you start going through a process of being recommended content. So you ask a question like, are COVID vaccines safe? A few years ago. And you Google that and you start seeing results that saying having vaccines all at once might be a problem. And depending on the drivers that influence you, it kind of draws you into this. Now, maybe you're like reading that and you think, oh, actually, the media, the government, medical professionals are saying that's not really true. But if you think, oh, maybe that's true, you click on it. And the algorithm notices and say, hey, you want more content about this stuff, so let me give that to you. And now you're seeing content, a subset of the content that you're seeing says that vaccines can make you sick. And you might say, well, that doesn't really feel true to me, but you're now encountering people who've had those experiences, or at least think they've had those experiences. And you click on that, and you start seeing some people who are saying, actually, vaccines are designed to make you sick. It's big pharma trying to make money off you poor, innocent people. And there's whole communities that agree with this, and we'll have lots of experts, people with doctors, even if they're a doctor of, I don't know, geology, telling you that actually, yeah, this stuff is true. So you click on again. And, oh my God, Bill Gates wants to put microchips in the vaccines. In fact, he's done it. We've all got microchips in our vaccines, and if the 5G towers are activated, we're all going to become 5G zombies. And there's people who really believe this stuff. There's people who take action on this stuff, who burn down 5G towers because they believe this stuff is actually true. Now, that's a very, very small subset of people, but the internet provides a perfect mechanism for basically effectively radicalizing anyone to the point of which they can hold their most radical beliefs on any subject under the sun. So we kind of have to understand these dynamics that are in action. And we also need to understand the communities that exist around this. So Kate Starbird did some brilliant work several years ago looking at the communities around anti-white helmet sentiment. So she took a set of Twitter content from a period of time, analyzed all the accounts that were sharing it, looked at the URLs that had articles with white helmets, articles on them, looked at ones which are positive and negative. And what you have here is basically a diagram that shows this in action. It's lots of circles and lines, which I'll explain in a second. So first of all, each circle is the amount of times there's an article on that domain about the white helmets. And each line you see emerging from those circles is one of those articles being republished, or articles being republished in part or full on other websites. So in the bottom left-hand corner, what you're seeing are mainstream news organizations who are sharing an AP article, so they have one connection for one article between all of them. But in this top right corner, which you can zoom into here, we're seeing basically a media ecosystem that is spreading anti-white helmets information. But you'll note they're very intertwined with each other. They're constantly sharing information with each other, reciting each other, and it kind of creates an illusion that there's a lot more of this content from more diverse sources than there really are. And if you look at those sources, such as 21st Century Wire, Mint Press News, Global Research, these are kind of more conspiracy-focused websites. You probably maybe categorize those as true believers and self-interested actors. But you also have Russia Today, Sputnik News, so those state actors who are sharing this. And they consistently present themselves as independent and alternative media and as offering a contrary perspective to mainstream news and views, which they claim purposely hide the truth from people. So going back to what we were seeing with Jackson Hinkle, that was what he was basically saying to his audience. This is a theme that runs through this. You cannot trust the government. You cannot trust the media. You have these ecosystems that are created around this. And this is just one example. This is probably one-to-one to the anti-Bellingcat community as well. So, yeah. So this ordered discourse doesn't always result in huge problems. Like the Flat Earth movement is not in power. But we know that's not always the case. So I want to talk about this idea of disordered discourse and institutional capture. So what we can see sometimes is institutions, the media, government, traditional institutions start being captured by disordered discourse. So this is the idea that these are absorbing into the core function of power and that it erodes the foundations of what I call progressive democracy. So when I talk about progressive democracy, when I was talking about those ideals earlier, if we're in a democracy that is moving towards those ideals or values those ideals, I would call that it's progressing towards those ideals, versus a regressive democracy that moves away from them. So I want to give you an example from a few years back that you're all going to be familiar with. And just keep in mind these drivers when we're discussing this, these drivers are still in place.
Welcome back. I'm back with Sidney Powell, who is part of President Trump's legal team in contesting this election. Sidney, we talked about the Dominion software. I know that there were voting irregularities. Tell me about that.
That's to put it mildly. The computer glitches could not and should not have happened at all. That is where the fraud took place, where they were flipping votes in the computer system or adding votes that did not exist. We need an audit of all of the computer systems that played any role in this fraud whatsoever.
So that's Sidney Powell 5 years ago talking about how the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And this video is really hard to find because most of this content has been scrubbed from the internet because Dominion sued Fox News and made a loss of money from doing that because these were all completely false claims. But these claims became widespread among the kind of Republican discourse around the election. We had Donald Trump posting continually after the election about how Dominion was responsible for stealing the election from him. It became part of really mainstream discourse. But it was completely false. And if you go through the court documents, it's really interesting. We know from the Fox emails discussing this that they knew it wasn't true. But what happened is they had started platforming these ideas, and it's what their audience started to believe and what they wanted. But then Newsmax started to having more and more stuff about this, so they realized that Newsmax was taking their audience, and despite them knowing this wasn't true, they were then required to actually, those drivers, those incentives, monetization, they needed advertising to be sold off the back of people watching their channels, so to get them to watch it, they had to publish stuff that they knew was not true. And this court document I'm going to take you through briefly now explains the origins of these claims. So it was sent to a source who described themselves as being pretty wackadoodle, which is not a good start. I mean, as a journalist, definitely avoid that. It alleged that Dominion was one common thread in the voting irregularities in a number of states. But it goes on. There's other theories within this. So, for example, they claim that Justice Scalia, who died recently, was purposely killed at the annual Bohemia Grove camp during a week-long human hunting expedition. Obviously, that didn't make it to Fox News. And that also that Roger Ailes, the Fox News CEO, who had died a few years earlier, and Rupert Murdoch huddled secretly to undermine Donald Trump, which is clearly not true because it involves someone who was dead. So the author continues, "Who am I, and how do I know all this? I've had the strangest dream since I was a little girl. I was internally decapitated, and yet I live. The wind tells me I'm a ghost, and I don't believe it." That is the source of the Dominion claims that Sidney Powell was going on Fox News. This is basically, I'm not going to call them a crazy person, but an interesting person who basically made stuff up, and it became a huge, huge part. It cost Fox News nearly $1 billion to pay off Dominion because of the damage they caused because of this. So let's look at why these are the stages of what I would call an institutional capture. So first there is the exposure of those institutions to these ideas. That you have kind of Sidney Powell calling up saying, "Hey, I've got some information on Dominion." And someone at Fox News saying, "Oh, hey, that's interesting." And then you have incentive alignments. So the institutions see incentives that align themselves with the incentives of the person who's sharing this untrue information with them. Now, they might believe this information is true, they might not, but in a sense it's actually irrelevant because it's about their incentives, those drivers that are saying, "Oh, well, we've got to have someone who's saying that the election was stolen from Donald Trump because that's what our audience wants." And then that starts being integrated into the narratives of the organizations. Again, those institutions may or may not believe it's true, but it starts becoming a problem because then it captures the behavior of those institutions. They start behaving, their actions are based off that disordered discourse until eventually it becomes embedded in the structure of their organization. And we can look over to the US at the moment and the White House, and I think we can clearly see that in action several times a day in many cases. And this creates a problem, because then you have institutions that are captured by disordered discourse. They may think to begin with they are in control of this, that they are using it for their own ends, that they're smarter than this. But what happens is they end up captured by it, because the people who are making the decisions, in many cases, either they believe the stuff, or they're too scared to say that they don't, or they have an incentive to keep on talking about it. It's like all these Republicans at the moment who say, oh, I'm too scared to talk about what's happening because it'll have a consequence on me. You know, huge bravery. So it starts with, we have a problem then. We start having problems identified by these institutions that are based off disordered discourse. The problem is that's flawed. So the solution that is created doesn't work. And because that doesn't work, they have to, the failure happens and they have to deny it's a failure. It's not our fault. It's some other, we can't be wrong. Because within disordered discourse, as I'm saying, when you have discourse absolutism, you cannot criticize the discourse, because then you are attacked, you become the enemy. You know, you become Liz Cheney. And then you therefore have to externalize the blame. Oh, it's the liberal media, it's woke, or it's whatever the hell it is. And it creates a cycle where this becomes reinforced continually, time and time again, because they cannot accept that they are wrong, because that would mean being attacked by their own group and externalized. And that means what happens within this kind of ideal model that I've come up is verification, instead it becomes distortion. That is no longer about trying to establish the truth, it's trying to distort things so the truth is always on your side, that you can never be wrong. Deliberation, instead it becomes division. It is not inclusive. Anyone who disagrees with you is attacked and externalized. And that accountability becomes deflection. It's not our fault, it's someone else's fault. It's, look over there, don't blame us for this. And the thing is, if this happens, then we have this idea of what I like to call regressive democracy. We move away from this ideal of democracy towards authoritarianism. And we can see this happening, and we see this kind of performance of democracy. You still get to vote, but does your vote really mean anything? We can look over at Erdogan's Turkey, for example, maybe America in a few years' time. We can see this happening all the time, you know, Hungary, for example. So what do we do about this? I don't want to come here and just give you all the problems. Now, I think we need to look at how we address these individual drivers. And that has to come from different parts of society. It can't just be all about civil society, NGOs. It can't just be about government intervention. I think in the past, a lot of government interventions have failed because they focused on this in terms of communication and information. We cannot create hundreds of fact-checking websites because those fact-checking websites don't actually engage in discourse. And we have to create discourse, I think, in my opinion. So Bellingcat has had a lot of experience dealing with this kind of thing in the past. And I think from that we can draw some conclusions on some interventions that I think will work. So since 2014, when I founded Bellingcat, we did a lot of work, starting with MH17. We did a lot of work then on the conflict in Ukraine, and we've spent 8 years really not only just doing our own investigations, but building a community of people who are engaged with the topic and actually understand open source investigation. So in 2022, with the invasion of Ukraine, we started seeing disinformation being published, and this is one example of it. So this is a video that was published by the Donetsk People's Republic, and as you can see, it doesn't really show that much. Okay, explosions in the background, gunfire, grass, but really not too much else. And this is a social media post on Telegram where the Donetsk People's Republic shared the video. And it's quite long, but what they were saying is that there was a Polish-speaking saboteur group that was trying to attack chlorine storage tanks at a water treatment plant, and they were killed, and that video is from one of their body cameras. Now, this is published on February 18th, 2022. The problem is with this video, for them, is that it was published with metadata in it. Telegram doesn't strip metadata like other social media channels. So we had pages and pages of this. And the online community who was engaged with Bellingcat's work and had been engaged with Ukraine knew about metadata. They knew how to look for this kind of stuff. So immediately they saw the file and started searching through the metadata for evidence. And there were a few things that stepped out to them. So the creation date was 10 days before the event took place. The project path also reflected that it was 10 days before the event took place. It was edited in Premiere Pro, which is why we had so much metadata, because that's what's added to it. And there was this thing called the pantry ingredients file path, which was the name of an MP4 file. And if you put that into YouTube, you get this video, which is from 2010. It's a firing range in Finland. And you have various explosions because they're firing rocket launchers. And these explosions, as audio engineer compared the waveforms of these explosions to the explosions in the video, and actually showed that they were the same explosions. They had taken the audio from this video and then inserted it into the fake video. And what we had with the metadata was a blueprint forgery. And this video is basically debunked within an hour of it being published online. So all that effort they put editing this video together just went out the window. Well, what I found really interesting about this is normally when you had disinformation published by these kind of groups, that the this sort of discourse community was kind of formed around these ideas, would kind of absorb it, and then you could never really challenge it. Because, again, if you try and say, oh, this isn't true within the group, then you get externalized from the group and attacked. So this is just one example of how having that kind of community resilience that's developed over years can be really effective. And here we're trying to see these three actors trying to influence true believers, but failing. Another thing that emerged is it's not just about resilience and fact-checking, it's also an opportunity to create useful information about the conflict. So these are various videos that were posted on TikTok by Russians living along the Russian border that showed troop movements in the days before the invasion. So you can see that it's the 19th of February 2022. Just a couple of days before the invasion. So online communities started to geolocate these. And a group called the Center for Information Resilience is Ben Strick in at the moment. Is he not here yet? Okay, Ben Strick will be speaking on Friday. It was part of this project where they, as a group, geolocated thousands of videos of just from the whole conflict. And these green dots are the ones that were geolocated in February just before the invasion. And it actually showed troop movements towards the border. And because there was a community doing it, rather than just a couple of people at Bellingcat, you could actually really rapidly process this information and get really useful information about what was happening on the ground. You could see specific military units moving along specific roads towards the border of Ukraine. And you can click on all of these and actually see the video itself. So you not only have the kind of conclusion, but you have the evidence to back it. And anyone can go in, use that data, they can verify it themselves, they can argue about it, but it's about being transparent, it's about having a process behind that as well. And there are various communities and accounts who, throughout the conflict and even now, geolocate these videos. And this is something that we've also created a process around at Bellingcat, because we believe that accountability for stuff is really, really important, so we want to create processes that create good information that can be used for those purposes. So we've been using a platform called Atlas with our trained volunteer community, where we can assign tasks based on each of these videos for them to verify the geolocation, and then that's re-verified by another member of our team. So in most cases, you'll have free video that will have the kind of social media verification on Twitter, you'll have the volunteer verification, and then a Bellingcat staff member also verifying the geolocation. And we add additional metadata to that. What, is it in a commercial, industrial, residential area? What munitions are visible in it? And it creates this civilian harm map. We focus primarily on civilian harm. And this is a map of all these videos as part of a downloadable data set that anyone can go and use, knowing it's verified information. It's not just stuff we're kind of guessing at. And this is used by a huge range of different actors. We know there's been various UN departments using it, organizations working on legal accountability, demining efforts using this data set. And this, again, emerged from an online community that's really engaged for this topic for a long time. I would say this isn't ideal, though. We do not want to have a situation where it requires 8 years of war to have a community that can resist against disinformation. So we have to think of interventions that are more systematic, that can go beyond just specific topics. So one thing we've been doing is working with the legal community around these ideas of developing open source investigation for use in war crime investigations, part of which is working with the Global Legal Action Network and Swansea University. We had a mock hearing on the admissibility of open source evidence, which was hugely useful for understanding how that can be used, and it's informed further reports and work. We've been working with the International Criminal Court on investigations in Ukraine using a methodology that we've developed. But we also need to focus on education. We need to teach people how to do this kind of stuff, not just through them encountering Bellingcat on social media and engaging enough to learn this stuff. Because I think what we're actually seeing here is a real crisis of information. It used to be that, say, you wanted to influence discourse in the kind of Lippmann model, you would be part of an institution, which meant that you had to go through a process of education, of working with an organization, building a reputation, and then maybe when you're in your 30s, you might be having some influence on the discourse around these topics. The problem is now, if you're a 13-year-old and you pick up a smartphone and you start looking at social media, you're engaging with an algorithm that, based on how many seconds you're looking at an individual post, what you're engaging with is informing the algorithm to what a 13-year-old wants to see. And the problem is, we aren't equipping children with any critical thinking skills, really. I think critical thinking is something that's really, really important to our education process. Finland does it really, really well. In my opinion, we need to be looking at the Finnish education system in terms of how they've integrated these critical thinking skills in their education system, because studies of their resilience against disinformation show that Finland is one of the leaders because they have that in place. Estonia is another place to look to. So if there are any policymakers who work on education, please look at that. But this is something else that I found really inspirational. I encountered this video a few years ago from a group called the Student View. So this is a group that goes into schools with journalists. They have groups of students who work on issues that they care about. And this is a video from Bradford where the students were really worried about high-speed police chases. And the journalist came in and said, do you know about freedom of information requests? Which they didn't. So they were taught how to ask the police about that information, and that allowed them to actually investigate something that they cared about and have an impact from it. And this is the video they produced to explain their work.
We got the news story from the students about the police chases. We thought it was a really good idea that they'd had, and we thought that it would be a really good story for the paper and the website. It's just the sort of thing that our readers are interested in, the sort of thing that affects people's daily lives in Bradford, and it's a really good thing for them to focus on.
Journalism is sort of a way to unravel a lot of mysteries in this world. The story was mainly about police chases in Bradford because they affect a lot of people, so that's where the idea came from.
Me and Ismail, we sat down on a computer and then we looked on the internet and we found out some information about it, and then we emailed the police to ask them questions. Before I wrote the article, I didn't know that you could email the police and ask them information.
Freedom of information request in to the police, and that's the sort of thing that journalists would do all the time, but for the students to do that is very sort of brave almost. And it's great that they know that they can do that, and this information is public information.
Before the Student View came in, I think I assumed that it would be about opinion-based articles. I didn't know much about the company, so I assumed that they might get students to think about issues in their community and then write an opinion piece. And I didn't realise that actually it would be much more factual and more like reporting than it was about them writing and making sure that students were well equipped before they wrote up a report, which is quite different to the skills they practice in English.
The Student View, I really didn't expect it to be like this, and I just thought it was just going to be an organisation that they're going to come in and probably they're going to do about 75% of the work. Normally we're not given a voice. People think, oh, you're too young, and they just go over your opinion and don't really listen to you. The programme mainly changed my opinion on this quite a bit, because wherever we got mentioned, it had our name written right underneath it.
So what we're seeing there is democratic empowerment, but involving young people on issues that they care about. And when we live in an information system where young people are part of the discourse, whether or not we like it, we need to kind of start thinking differently about how we approach the media. How that, in the peer-to-peer information age, rather than the top-down information age, we're all participants in not just consuming information, but its creation and spread. And we worked with the Student View to develop course material for teachers to start teaching them some of these ideas. Unfortunately, the Student View went bankrupt, which ended that prematurely, but we were able to produce a large amount of course material. We've been making that available to teachers, and our hope is that as things move forwards, there can be more opportunities in secondary schools to do this. But this is not something that Bellingcat can do by itself. It's a far, far too big issue to approach this. We need government-level policy intervention to the approach to education. And I really think we need to change the approach to education. Something else Bellingcat is doing is working with universities to create investigative hubs. So the idea is that we go into universities, we help them develop course material around open source investigation. That can be on a range of different topics as well. And we create an investigative hub at those universities. But those hubs are then able to connect with local NGOs, school and media to find opportunities for collaboration. And then we do that with multiple universities and we connect them together. And they can work in collaboration together across multiple topics nationally, and then we connect that internationally to create these international networks of universities. Because what starts emerging there are interesting things. So an investigation process developed by one university can be used by other universities on similar issues. Technology that's developed by computer science departments can be used throughout the entire network rather than it being stuck in one location. Say there's a protest at a US university and the police start getting violent, which may happen in the next 4 years. Rather than it just being up to those students to figure out what's happening, the entire network can engage because that process is quite straightforward. And that's actually something we've already done in Utrecht University with the Open Source Global Justice Investigation Lab. So we went in there, we developed course material, we set up the investigation lab. We did this in partnership with other organizations such as Amnesty and Air Wars. And their first major investigation, is that a test or are we in trouble? I'll continue. Actually, should I show? No, good. Great, we're going to live. Cool. Their first major investigation was about police violence that targeted protesters at a pro-Palestinian protest. It showed that there were students who were targeted by excessive force by the police. It created national media attention. It forced the police to respond, forced the university to respond because they were the ones who called the police in the first place. But this is something we're currently working on with Birmingham, Nottingham, and Stirling University to expand. We're hoping in the 25 and 26 school year to start implementing the first version of this in those universities. And our hope is long-term we'll expand that. I know there's a lot of you from academia in this room today, so if you want to come to me and have a chat about that, please do. We're looking for potential future partners as well. And my hope is that through explaining that all to you, that as we start having the further discussions throughout this week, that you have some framework to think about it in. And I'd just like to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to speaking to you all one-on-one throughout the week. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lee McIntyre. Wonderful talk. I wanted to ask you a question about trust. You mentioned Flat Earth a few times. I went to the Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, Colorado in 2018. What I noticed is that they not only had very strange beliefs about the Earth, they had a profound lack of trust in science, in media, in government. And that wasn't an accident. So no evidence could convince them because, of course, they had been poisoned into distrusting any truthful information sources. One imagines that's due to disinformation, because disinformation doesn't just cause false beliefs, but it also encourages you to distrust and even to hate people who don't believe the same falsehood you do. So my question is this. Wonderful examples of how we can use evidence and all the things that you did about the tagging for the videos that create an evidential trail. But what good are those if the person seeing them don't trust you? So what I'd like to know in essence is this. What can we do to increase trust in science? And is that the same as fighting disinformation?
Yeah, I recognize your experience at the Flat Earth Conference has been reflected in so many different communities. That sense of deep distrust is something that's a real problem, and it's constantly being reinforced. And to trust those institutions that are being rejected by these groups is to be expelled from the group that you're part of. So it makes it really, really hard once people have crossed a certain threshold to pull them away from that. And if you look at interventions at that point that work, it's generally because people are having personal crisis and they aren't being supported by that group anymore, which is rare and difficult. I'd recommend Mariana Spring's book, Among the Trolls, on this topic in particular, because she goes out and speaks to people who've gone through this experience, and that repeated pattern is really interesting to observe. I think, again, when we're looking at the idea of trust, the problem is we aren't equipping people with the ability at school age, at primary level, at secondary level, to make those calls. So instead, the most engaging content becomes the stuff they start building their kind of structures of trust around. It's the people who are appealing to what they already believe. But if you're an 11-year-old with a smartphone, what are your beliefs? What are your deeply held beliefs? Not much, so they are being defined by groups that they are being algorithmically recommended by social media. And I think that's something why we need to keep going back to this idea of this has to be led by education, not as an add-on where 1 hour a term kids get to fact-check headlines, which, if you're teaching kids how to fact-check headlines, just reassess how they use social media. We need to really go in there and start thinking at this more fundamental level, that throughout all subjects we have that element of critical thinking, because they are going to encounter information in a way that older generations didn't. That they aren't encountering, like, who here has got an 8 to 12-year-old? How many of your 8 to 12-year-olds regularly read a newspaper? Yeah. How often do they sit down and watch the TV news? Is the TV news even on in the background? No, because we've changed the way we consume information, and it means they're they're encountering information only through a very different way. It's no longer coming from these kind of institutional sources, the media. It's coming through whoever they're algorithmically recommended on social media, and that is guaranteed to screw people up 100% of the time.
How worried about the incentive structure for traditional media are you? How concerned are you? You take any of these publications, they're also trying to get exposure on Facebook or on social media sites. You have to push the barriers of clickbaity headlines, use of images. How concerned are you that the incentive structure for someone like Jackson Hinkle is actually fairly similar from a monetization standpoint as what the pressures we're putting on traditional media?
Yeah, I kind of also see that as a form of institutional capture, that they're captured by those drivers. And it's like we saw with Fox News, that's a really clear example of it. But if you look at the kind of, like the way, for example, the Mail Online is now doing more and more clickbaity headlines, or the Express Online, those kind of websites. I think those conditions really, especially the financial drivers, really, really encourages that kind of behavior. And while they may see it as just a way of framing information that they think is true, it doesn't always kind of come across that to those publics who are engaging with it. But the problem is, and this may come up in conversation during the week, that how do you monetize the truth? How do you make it valuable to people? How do you make it something that they actually want to click on? And we struggle with that at Bellingcat all the time. Because we, as many of you know, write quite long articles with lots of details and fact-checking and verification. But we need to create other types of content for different sorts of audiences. And breaking through to those audiences is very difficult when you aren't able to make stuff that's like engaging in 3 seconds. And how do you explain a complex war crime investigation in 3 seconds so someone keeps watching it for another 5 seconds before they get bored and move on? So kind of capturing the attention of people as they're scrolling through their social media feeds, be it text-based, video-based, or picture-based, is really, really difficult if you're doing fact-based investigative journalism. And then turning that into a business model is even harder. I mean, Bellingcat's based off donations that we get rather than, we don't have any advertising on the website because we just don't have enough people looking at the website to generate that. So there's also the challenge of, if you want to have media that creates good investigations, that's truthful, how do you actually make that something that's sustainable? And there's still a really big question about that.
Thank you. You've done some impressive work in helping to identify the misinformation with the metadata on the files. So thank you for that. My question, though, is can you speak more about how to make that effective? On the one hand, once you've identified the fake video, how do you ensure that the audience that saw the original fake then sees the debunking information? And on the second part, what's to keep them from simply trying to discredit you in other ways, saying so that you've provided the information, but they then simply say, oh, they're also lying. So it's another layer of lie on top of the lie. So the first question is about the reach and efficacy, and the second is preserving your own credibility with your debunking information.
Well, on the second one, I mean, we'll be attacked whatever happens by those groups, so it's not something we have as our calculus, really. It's like whatever we say, we know there's always going to be communities who think Bellingcat is the CIA, and that's all they need to know about anything that we're saying. In that example I gave you from Ukraine, that was actually a kind of counter-discourse that was emerging around the conflict. You had the kind of disordered discourse that was, the Russian state putting out stuff, the usual community who, thought Russia was blameless, making claims and, putting out content. People like Patrick Lancaster, for example. And then we also had kind of communities that were kind of emerged around Bellingcat. They weren't Bellingcat's community. They were people engaged with open source investigation, engaged with the conflicts of Ukraine, who were able to, there was discussion around this. This wasn't just one person saying, oh, I fact-checked this. This was an ongoing discussion on Twitter, across social media platforms of people discussing this. And I think that's what's really important. It's why I think fact-checking websites so frequently fail, because they're creating information, they aren't creating discourse. So we have to look at how we create that discourse that is fact-based, that kind of, looking back at those democratic ideals I suggest, are based on moving towards those rather than moving away from those. That those are because the discourse creates those values. And with any community where there is the disordered discourse, they create their own values as well. So I think we need to look at how we create values within the discourse that we want to happen, but also how to create that discourse in the first place. And I think having this approach where we have this education lead, I think can be very effective for that, because the young people are going to be the news influencers of the future, and if we aren't equipping them with the skills they need to be good news influencers, then they're inevitably going to be bad news influencers.
Hello, I'm Francine McKenna, and I'm an academic and a journalist who focuses on financial fraud. And I'm intrigued by your distinction between misinformation and malinformation. And I'm thinking back to the financial crisis, the 2008 financial crisis, and some actors who were considered credible during that period. Even RT had people talking about the financial fraud and about the banks, Matt Taibbi, et cetera. And the progression over the last 15 years where now they're involved in other things. Obviously, RT is a Russian state-sponsored. Taibbi was involved in the Twitter files, et cetera. What happens? Why did that happen? And how do you kind of keep track of the fact that some actors change stripes?
I think it's because they have those drivers that, oh, you can't trust the government. Like Matt Taibbi, I think for him, a lot of it is like, oh, I know you can't trust the government. So therefore, when I consider stuff the government's saying, it must be a lie. It's kind of like Seymour Hersh's work on the chemical weapons attacks in Syria. seem more driven by his own biases than actual facts. Someone tells him something that reinforces what he already believes is true. He writes an article about it, and now it's part of the discussion. Russia Today, I mean, they were really motivated by their coverage of what was it called? The movement? Slipped my mind. Yeah, Occupy movement. I think that was, again, motivated because they saw it as something happening in America that was against the kind of American establishment, so it's worth them covering it. You had people like Tim Pool, for example, emerging from that Occupy movement as well, who, he was the first person asked the question at the White House press briefing yesterday. So you see these people kind of, they're being, that kind of pyramid filter I had, they get filtered towards the most extreme version of their beliefs because they're having those drivers, those incentives, constantly reinforced by their lived experiences. And I want to say as well that these incentives, these drivers, can be based on real, genuine things. It's like a lot of people who deny chemical weapons attacks in Syria refer to the 2003 invasion of Iraq, which is a legitimate thing to refer to for a reason not to trust the government. But when that becomes the lens through which you see the entire world, then you become influenced by your own biases. And that's where you, I think, get kind of radicalized to a point where you can't actually, you become part of that ecosystem.